The blood on Teresa Nichols' hands wouldn't wash away, no matter how hard she scrubbed in the frigid creek water flowing behind the abandoned cabin. It wasn't her blood, it belonged to the man she'd called husband for 3 tortuous years. 3 years of bruises hidden beneath high collars and long sleeves. 3 years of explanations to concerned neighbors in Wallace, Idaho. 3 years too many. It was April 1885, and spring hadn't fully arrived in the wooded mountains surrounding the old mining settlement. Teresa's fingers numbed as she finally gave up trying to cleanse away the evidence of what she'd done, what she'd been forced to do. Charles had come at her with that knife again, drunk and raging about dinner being cold when he returned from the saloon. This time, she'd managed to turn the blade against him during their struggle. She hadn't meant to kill him only to escape, but the knife had slid between his ribs with horrifying ease. Now she was hiding in this dilapidated trapper's cabin 2 miles outside of town, certain that the law would never believe her side of the story. Charles Nichols was a respected businessman in Wallace. She was just his pretty, quiet wife. Teresa retreated inside the cabin as darkness fell, wrapping herself in the thin blanket she'd grabbed during her frantic flight from town. The abandoned structure offered little protection against the elements. Its roof leaked in several places, and wind whistled through gaps in the log walls. But it was better than the jail cell that surely awaited her if Sheriff Davis found her. Hungry and exhausted, she curled into the corner furthest from the door, listening to the woods come alive with night sounds. Something scurried across the roof, a squirrel or perhaps a raccoon. An owl hooted in the distance. And then, most terrifying of all, the distinct sound of approaching hoofbeats. Teresa held her breath, pressing herself against the rough wall. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped altogether. Heavy boots crunched on the dried leaves outside. A man's voice called out, low but clear. "Hello, anyone in there?" She didn't answer, hoping whoever it was would assume the cabin was empty and move on. But the door creaked open, and a tall silhouette filled the doorway. "I know someone's here," the man said, softer this time. "I can see your footprints outside, and that's fresh blood by the creek." Teresa clutched the small knife she'd kept from the kitchen, her last defense. "Stay back," she warned, her voice shaking despite her attempt at strength. "I'll use this if I have to." The man remained in the doorway, making no move to enter further. "Madam, I'm not here to hurt you." He struck a match, lighting a small lantern he carried, illuminating a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Name's Blake Jamison. I was tracking a wounded deer when I came across your trail." The light revealed a man perhaps in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that crinkled at the corners. His face was partially obscured by several days' growth of beard, but there was something in his expression, a gentleness that contradicted his rugged appearance. "You're bleeding," he observed. Teresa glanced down at her dress, stained with Charles' blood. "It's not mine." Blake nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. "You're Teresa Nichols, aren't you? Charles Nichols' wife." Her heart sank. "How did you? News travels fast, even to those of us who live outside town. They're saying Charles was found dead in your kitchen. Sheriff's got a posse looking for you." Teresa's grip tightened on her knife. "Are you going to turn me in?" Blake studied her for a long moment. The lantern light revealed the bruise blossoming on her cheekbone and the finger marks on her wrist where Charles had grabbed her. "No," he said finally. "I reckon you had your reasons." Relief flooded through her, so intense she nearly collapsed. "He was going to kill me this time," she whispered. "He's threatened it before, but tonight was different. I could see it in his eyes." Blake set his lantern down and slowly removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair. "I've heard things about Charles Nichols." Not many spoke of it openly, but rumors get around. "Nobody ever did anything," Teresa said bitterly. "They all looked the other way. That's the way of things, unfortunately. Men like Charles have money and influence." Blake glanced over his shoulder into the darkness. "But right now, we need to think about your safety. This cabin isn't secure, and it's the first place they'll look when daylight comes." "I have nowhere else to go." Blake seemed to wrestle with a decision. "I have a place further up in the hills. It's remote, no one would think to look there." Teresa hesitated. Trading one man's violence for another's wasn't a choice at all. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." I know enough, Blake said quietly, and I know what it's like to be hunted for something that wasn't your fault. There was a story there, Teresa thought, but now wasn't the time to ask. If they catch you helping me, you'll hang alongside me. A ghost of a smile crossed Blake's face. Then we best not get caught. He moved back to the doorway, scanning the forest. We can't leave tonight, too dangerous to navigate these woods in the dark, especially with a posse searching. I'll stand guard until morning, then we'll head out at first light. You're staying, Blake nodded. Someone needs to keep watch. You try to get some rest, Mrs. Nichols. Teresa, she corrected automatically. If you're risking your life for me, you might as well use my name. Teresa, he repeated, and something in the way he said it made her cheeks warm. Blake settled just inside the doorway, rifle across his lap, hat pulled low over his eyes. Teresa watched him for a long time, wondering about this strange, quiet cowboy who'd appeared out of nowhere to offer help. Eventually, the events of the day caught up with her, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep. She dreamed of blood and shouting, of Charles lunging for her with that gleaming knife. She dreamed of running through endless woods, voices calling her name, branches tearing at her skin and clothes. She woke with a start, a cry caught in her throat, to find Blake kneeling beside her. Easy, he murmured. You were having a nightmare. Teresa blinked, disoriented. Gray dawn light filtered through the cabin's single dirty window. I'm sorry if I disturbed you. No need for apologies. Blake offered her his canteen. Drink some water, we should move soon. The water tasted sweet and cool. Teresa hadn't realized how thirsty she was. Thank you, Blake nodded, moving back to his position by the door. I checked the area at first light. No sign of anyone yet, but they'll be expanding their search today. Did you sleep at all? Teresa asked, noting the dark circles under his eyes. I'll sleep when we're safe, he replied simply. Teresa studied him in the growing light. His clothes were worn but clean, faded denim pants, a chambray shirt, and a leather vest. The six-shooter at his hip looked well-maintained, and the rifle he carried was clearly a prized possession. He didn't have the flashy appearance of the gamblers who frequented Charles' establishment, nor the rough, unwashed look of the miners. There was something deliberate about Blake Jamison, purposeful. You're not just a hunter, she observed. Blake glanced at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. No, madam, I do some hunting, some trapping, but mostly I work with horses. Break them for the cavalry contracts, train them for ranchers and such. A horse whisperer, Teresa said, remembering stories she'd heard. A small smile touched his lips. Some call it that, I just understand them better than most people. Teresa stood, folding her blanket carefully. My father raised horses in Montana before he died. I used to help him with the gentling. Is that so? Interest sparked in Blake's eyes. That's a rare skill for a woman. My father had no sons, Teresa explained. He taught me everything he knew, Charles. She paused, the familiar pain rising. Charles thought it unladylike. He forbade me from going near the stables in town. Blake's expression darkened. Charles Nichols sounds like a man who enjoyed controlling what wasn't his to control. Teresa couldn't argue with that assessment. What's your plan? She asked, changing the subject. My cabin is about 4 hours' ride from here, high up in the hills. We'll take my horse as far as we can, then go on foot through the rocky areas to hide our trail. Blake peered out the window again. I brought some provisions, but we'll need to move quickly. And then what? Teresa asked quietly. Blake turned to face her. Then we figure out how to clear your name. Teresa gave a bitter laugh. Clear my name? I killed my husband, Mr. Jamison. There's no clearing that. Blake, he corrected. And self-defense isn't murder, no matter what some might say. You think anyone will believe that? Charles was, she broke off, remembering her husband's standing in the community, the donations to the church, the free drinks for the sheriff. It doesn't matter what the truth is, it only matters what people believe. Blake studied her for a long moment. Maybe, but I've seen enough of the world to know justice sometimes needs a helping hand. He moved toward the door. Let me check on my horse, then we'll get moving. Teresa watched him slip outside, wondering what kind of man would risk everything to help a stranger accused of murder. She didn't have long to ponder this question before Blake returned, his expression grim. Riders coming, he said without preamble, at least 3 of them following the creek. Teresa felt the blood drain from her face. The posse. Likely so. We need to move now. Blake quickly gathered his few belongings. Is there anything you need to bring? Teresa looked at the thin blanket, her only possession. Just this. Blake nodded, taking it from her and rolling it tightly. My horse is hidden about 50 yards back. We'll circle wide around the riders. Stay close to me, step where I step, and move quietly. Teresa followed him out the back of the cabin, crouching low as he led her into the dense underbrush. The forest was awakening around them, birds calling, small creatures rustling in the dried leaves. Every sound seemed magnified by her fear. They moved slowly, Blake frequently stopping to listen or examine the ground. Teresa tried to mimic his careful footsteps, mindful of breaking twigs or disturbing stones. The voices of the search party occasionally drifted to them on the morning breeze, men calling to each other, the nickering of horses. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached a small clearing where a magnificent buckskin stallion was tethered. The horse's ears pricked forward at their approach, but he made no sound. "This is Rusty," Blake whispered, approaching the animal with a gentle hand. "He's the best horse I've ever known, and he'll carry us both without complaint." Teresa approached the stallion, admiring his strong lines and intelligent eyes. "He's beautiful. And quiet as a shadow when he needs to be," Blake added, untying the reins. "Can you still ride astride?" Teresa nodded. It had been years since she'd ridden properly. Charles had insisted she use a side saddle like a proper lady, but she remembered the feeling of freedom that came with sitting a horse the way her father had taught her. Blake helped her mount, then swung up behind her. The saddle wasn't designed for two, putting them in close proximity. Teresa felt the solid warmth of his chest against her back, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. "I apologize for the familiarity," he murmured close to her ear. "Once we're clear of danger, we can take turns walking." "It's fine," Teresa assured him, though she couldn't deny the strange flutter in her stomach at his nearness. After years of flinching from Charles' touch, she was surprised to find Blake's proximity didn't frighten her. They set off at a walk, Blake guiding Rusty through the densest parts of the forest, away from the sounds of the search party. The stallion moved with surprising grace for such a large animal, carefully placing each hoof to minimize noise. Teresa's thoughts tumbled over each other as they rode. Just yesterday, she had been preparing dinner in her kitchen, trapped in a life that had become unbearable. Now she was fleeing through the wilderness with a stranger, wanted for murder. The enormity of her situation threatened to overwhelm her. "You're shaking," Blake observed quietly. "I'm sorry," Teresa whispered. "It's just, I never imagined this is where I would end up." Blake's voice was gentle near her ear. "Few of us end up where we imagine, for better or worse." After a moment, he added, "How did you come to marry Charles Nichols?" The question surprised her. No one had ever asked her that before. "My father died when I was 19. The ranch had debts I couldn't pay. Charles was visiting from Idaho looking to buy horses." She swallowed hard at the memory. "He offered to settle the debts in exchange for marriage. I thought I was being practical." Blake was silent for a moment. "When did he first hit you?" Teresa stiffened, then forced herself to relax. "On our wedding night, I wasn't." She couldn't finish the sentence. "You don't need to explain," Blake said softly. "Some men are monsters wearing human skin." They rode in silence after that, the forest gradually changing around them as they climbed higher into the hills. The tall pines gave way to rocky outcroppings and scrubby juniper. Blake occasionally had them dismount to walk across rocky sections, carefully obscuring their trail. By midday, Teresa's legs ached from the unaccustomed riding, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. She hadn't eaten since the previous morning, too distraught after Charles' attack to think of food. As if reading her thoughts, Blake guided Rusty into a sheltered gully where a small spring bubbled from between rocks. "We'll rest here briefly," he said, dismounting and helping Teresa down. Her legs nearly buckled when she hit the ground, and Blake steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "Thank you," she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. "You're doing remarkably well," he assured her, reaching into his saddlebag. He produced a small package wrapped in oilcloth. It's not much, but it'll keep us going. Inside was dried venison, hard biscuits, and a handful of dried berries. Simple trail food, but to Teresa, it looked like a feast. They ate in silence, both of them listening intently for any sound of pursuit. How much farther? Teresa asked when they had finished. About 3 more hours, Blake replied, carefully repacking the remaining food. The terrain gets rougher from here, but that works in our favor, harder to track. And your cabin, it's safe, Blake nodded. It's well hidden. I built it myself in a spot that can't be seen until you're right upon it. Even folks who have lived in these hills for decades don't know it's there. Why so secretive? Teresa asked, then immediately regretted her prying. I'm sorry, that's not my business. Blake studied the horizon for a moment before answering. I fought for the Union during the war. Afterward, I couldn't settle back into normal life, too many ghosts. His voice was measured, as if carefully choosing each word. I came west to find peace, I suppose. Found I preferred the company of mountains and horses to most people. Teresa considered his words. And yet you're risking everything to help me. A small smile touched his lips. As I said, most people, not all. Something in his gaze made Teresa look away, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. She busied herself adjusting her skirt, uncertain how to respond. Blake seemed to sense her discomfort and stood, offering his hand. We should keep moving. I'd like to reach the cabin before dark. They continued their journey, alternating between riding double and walking to spare Rusty. The landscape grew increasingly wild and beautiful, with breathtaking views of distant mountains and valleys. Under different circumstances, Teresa might have enjoyed the adventure. As the afternoon waned, Blake became more vigilant, frequently stopping to listen or examine the trail behind them. During one such pause, Teresa gathered her courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. Do you truly believe I could be cleared of killing Charles? Blake turned to her, his expression serious. I believe the truth has power even when people try to bury it. Your husband had enemies, Teresa, men who knew what he was behind closed doors. But they never spoke up before, she pointed out. Fear is a powerful silencer, Blake acknowledged. But so is guilt. Charles is dead now, they might be more willing to speak against a ghost than a living man. Teresa wasn't convinced. Even if some people believed me, the law wouldn't. Sheriff Davis was Charles' friend. They played cards together every Wednesday. Blake's jaw tightened. Sheriff Davis is part of the problem. He's turned a blind eye to more than just Charles' treatment of you. Before Teresa could ask what he meant, Blake held up a hand for silence. They both froze, listening. At first, Teresa heard nothing, but then faintly the sound of men's voices carried on the wind. They're still following, Blake murmured, frowning. They're more persistent than I expected. Or they know these hills better than you thought, Teresa suggested, fear rising in her throat. Blake helped her back onto Rusty. We'll change our route. It'll take longer, but it's safer. He led them up a nearly invisible game trail, so steep in places that Teresa had to cling to Rusty's mane. The buckskin picked his way carefully, seemingly unbothered by the difficult terrain. The sun was beginning to set when Blake finally pointed to a narrow ravine ahead. We're almost there. My cabin is just beyond those rocks. Relief flooded through Teresa. Her entire body ached with fatigue, and the emotional strain of the past 2 days had left her feeling hollowed out. The promise of shelter of safety, however temporary, was overwhelming. They dismounted at the entrance to the ravine, Blake leading Rusty through the narrow passage. The walls rose steeply on either side, creating deep shadows in the fading light. Teresa stayed close behind Blake, one hand on Rusty's flank for reassurance. The ravine opened suddenly into a small, hidden valley. Nestled against the far rock wall was a cabin, so perfectly blended with its surroundings that Teresa might have missed it if Blake hadn't pointed it out. Constructed of local stone and timber, with a sod roof sprouting mountain grasses, it looked like a natural extension of the landscape. It's wonderful, Teresa breathed, taking in the little creek that bubbled past the cabin and the small corral built into the rock wall. Blake's expression softened with pride. It's not much, but it's mine. He led Rusty toward the corral. Let me tend to him first, then I'll show you inside. Teresa waited by the cabin door, watching as Blake efficiently removed Rusty's tack and rubbed the horse down. There was obvious affection between man and animal. Rusty leaning into Blake's touch, Blake murmuring words too low for Teresa to hear. It spoke well of a man, she thought, how he treated his horse. When Blake finally joined her, the last light was fading from the sky. He opened the cabin door, gesturing for her to enter. "It's simple," he warned. "Not what you're used to, I imagine." Teresa stepped inside, immediately struck by the cabin's warmth. Not physical warmth, the interior was cool, but the sense of welcome it conveyed. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A table and 2 chairs sat nearby, with shelves holding books and cooking implements. A narrow bed was built into the far wall, covered with colorful woven blankets. Everything was neat, well-crafted, and purposeful. "It's lovely," she said honestly. Blake moved past her to light a lamp. "The stream provides fresh water year-round. There's a root cellar out back with preserves. We should be comfortable enough while we figure things out." Teresa's exhaustion suddenly crashed over her like a wave. She swayed slightly, and Blake was immediately at her side, guiding her to one of the chairs. "You're dead on your feet," he observed. "When did you last sleep properly?" Teresa couldn't remember. Before Charles," she admitted. Blake nodded, his face grim. "You take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." "I can't take your bed," Teresa protested. "You can and will," Blake replied firmly. "No arguments, you need proper rest." Too tired to protest further, Teresa allowed Blake to help her to the bed. The moment she lay down on the surprisingly comfortable mattress, her eyelids grew impossibly heavy. "Sleep," Blake told her softly. "You're safe here." And for the first time in years, Teresa believed those words. She drifted into darkness, vaguely aware of Blake moving quietly around the cabin and then nothing at all. She woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, she couldn't place where she was or why. Then memory returned in a rush. Charles, the knife, the blood, her flight, and Blake. Teresa sat up slowly, noting that someone had removed her boots and covered her with an extra blanket during the night. Blake was at the fireplace, his back to her as he tended to something cooking in a cast iron skillet. "Good morning," he said without turning, somehow aware that she was awake. "How do you feel?" "Better," Teresa admitted, surprised to find it true. Her body still ached, but the fog of exhaustion had lifted. "What time is it?" "Nearly 9, Blake replied, glancing over his shoulder with a small smile. "You slept like the dead." Teresa flinched at his choice of words, and Blake immediately looked contrite. "Poor choice of words, I apologize." "It's fine," she assured him, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "Something smells wonderful." "Just bacon and Jonna cakes," Blake said, turning his attention back to the skillet. "Nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." Teresa moved to the wash basin he'd set out, grateful for the opportunity to clean her face and hands. The cold water revived her further, making her more aware of her disheveled appearance. Her dress was stained with blood and dirt, her hair tangled and falling from its pins. As if reading her thoughts, Blake gestured to a wooden chest near the bed. "I have some spare clothes in there. They'll be too big, but they're clean, and there's a comb on the shelf." Teresa hesitated. "I can't take your clothes." Blake looked up from his cooking. "Teresa, your dress is covered in blood. If anyone saw you like that, there'd be no question of your guilt." His expression softened. "Besides, it's practical. We may need to move quickly if trouble comes." Put that way, Teresa couldn't argue. She opened the chest and found several shirts and pants, all well worn but meticulously mended. She selected the smallest shirt and a pair of trousers, along with a leather belt to cinch the waist. "I'll step outside while you change," Blake offered, setting 2 plates on the table. Teresa waited until the door closed behind him before quickly stripping off her ruined dress. She hesitated before removing her corset and petticoat as well, but practicality won out. She couldn't run from the law trussed up like a Sunday chicken. Blake's shirt hung nearly to her knees, and she had to roll the sleeves several times. The trousers were similarly oversized, but the belt helped keep them from sliding off entirely. She used the comb to work the tangles from her hair, then braided it simply down her back. When she opened the door, Blake was waiting a respectful distance away, attending to Rusty. He turned at the sound, and something in his expression made her self-conscious. "I must look ridiculous," she said, fighting the urge to cross her arms over her chest. "Not at all," Blake replied, his voice slightly rough. "You look different, but not in a bad way." Teresa wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she changed the subject. "Thank you for breakfast, I'm famished." Blake seemed grateful for the redirect. "Let's eat while it's hot then." They settled at the small table, and Teresa was surprised by how comfortable the silence between them felt. The food was simple but delicious, especially to her hungry body. "What will happen now?" she asked finally, setting down her coffee cup. Blake considered her question. "We need information." "I have a friend in Wallace Thomas Green, the blacksmith. He has no love for Charles Nichols or Sheriff Davis. He might be willing to find out what's being said about your disappearance." Teresa frowned. "Isn't it dangerous to involve others?" "Thomas can be trusted," Blake assured her. "He helped me once when I was in trouble, never asked questions, never told a soul." "What kind of trouble?" Teresa asked before she could stop herself. Blake's expression closed slightly. "The kind that follows a man home from war sometimes." He didn't elaborate, and Teresa didn't press. "When will you contact him?" "I'll ride down tomorrow, approach his place after dark." Blake took a sip of his coffee. "In the meantime, we should prepare for various possibilities." "You mean if they find us here?" Teresa said quietly. Blake nodded. "I don't think they will. This place is well hidden, but I believe in being prepared." "And if they do find us, what then?" Blake met her gaze steadily. "Then we fight or we run, whichever gives us the better chance." The matter-of-fact way he said it should have frightened Teresa, but instead she found it reassuring. Blake wasn't making false promises or offering empty comfort. He was facing their situation honestly. "I won't go back," she said firmly. "I won't hang for defending myself." "No," Blake agreed. "You won't." There was a promise in those simple words that made Teresa's throat tight with emotion. This man, this virtual stranger, was willing to stand between her and death. It was more protection than anyone had offered her in years. They spent the day preparing the cabin for potential threats. Blake showed Teresa his emergency supplies, extra ammunition, dried food, canteens, and basic medical items. He had escape routes planned, alternate shelters identified. "You've thought of everything," Teresa observed as they finished their preparations. Blake shrugged. "The war taught me to always have a backup plan, and another backup for that one." As afternoon turned to evening, they settled into a surprisingly comfortable domestic routine. Blake taught Teresa how to use his rifle just in case, he said, and she helped him prepare a stew from preserved vegetables and dried meat. "You're good with that knife," Blake commented as she deftly chopped carrots. Teresa's hands stilled for a moment. "My mother taught me to cook." She said a woman's place was in the kitchen, but at least there she could be queen of her own small domain. She resumed chopping more slowly. "Charles didn't like my cooking. Nothing was ever good enough." Blake made a non-committal sound, but Teresa could see the tightening around his eyes. "Some men aren't satisfied with anything short of perfection while offering none themselves." "Were you ever married?" Teresa asked impulsively. Blake shook his head. "No, came close once before the war. Elizabeth was her name." A shadow crossed his face. "She married someone else while I was fighting. Can't blame her. Many women didn't want broken men returning from battle." "You don't seem broken to me," Teresa observed quietly. Blake looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "Maybe not anymore. Time and distance heal much." After a pause, he added, "Horses help too. They don't care what you've done or seen. They only care how you treat them in the moment." Teresa nodded. "My father said something similar. He said horses can see into your soul." "Wise man, your father." They ate their stew as the sun set, conversation flowing more easily now. Blake told stories of breaking particularly stubborn horses, and Teresa shared memories of her childhood in Montana. Neither mentioned Charles or the circumstances that had brought them together, as if by tacit agreement. As darkness settled completely, Blake lit the lamp and stoked the fire. The cabin grew warm and cozy, a stark contrast to the danger that lurked beyond their hidden valley. "I should check on Rusty before turning in," Blake said, rising from his chair. Teresa nodded, suddenly reluctant to be alone with her thoughts. May I join you? I'd like some fresh air. They stepped outside together into the cool night. Stars carpeted the sky above, more than Teresa had ever seen in town. The creek's gentle babbling provided a soothing backdrop as they walked to the corral where Rusty greeted them with a soft nickering. He likes you, Blake observed as the horse extended his muzzle toward Teresa. She stroked Rusty's nose gently. The feeling is mutual. He's a magnificent animal. I raised him from a colt, Blake said, pride evident in his voice. His dam was a wild Mustang caught by mistake in a roundup. She was pregnant when they brought her in. Most wanted to separate them after birth, train the colt conventionally, but I saw something special in him. How did you end up with him? Bought him for next to nothing. Nobody thought he'd amount to too much wild blood, but I knew better. Blake patted Rusty's neck affectionately. Some spirits shouldn't be broken, just guided. Teresa thought there might be a metaphor in his words that applied to more than horses, but before she could consider it further, a distant sound caught her attention. She froze, listening intently. Did you hear that? She whispered. Blake nodded, his relaxed demeanor instantly vanishing. He moved to the edge of the small valley, climbing onto a rocky outcropping to look toward the distant trail. Teresa followed, heart pounding. In the far distance, barely visible in the moonlight, several tiny pinpricks of light moved along the mountainside. Torches, Blake murmured. They're still searching. How close are they? Teresa asked, her voice barely audible. Miles away yet and not on the right trail, Blake assured her. But they're more determined than I expected, or more afraid, Teresa suggested. Perhaps they fear what I might reveal about Charles if I'm not caught and silenced. Blake glanced at her sharply. What do you mean? Teresa hesitated. She hadn't planned to share this particular secret, but Blake deserved to know everything if he was risking his life for her. Charles wasn't just cruel to me, she said carefully. He was involved in other, unsavory activities, smuggling liquor to the Indian reservations, lending money at impossible rates, rigging card games. Blake's expression hardened. I suspected as much. There were rumors, but nothing concrete. I found ledgers, Teresa continued. Hidden in a compartment beneath our bedroom floor, names, dates, amounts all recorded in Charles' handwriting. Sheriff Davis' name was there too, receiving regular payments. Where are these ledgers now? Blake asked intently. Teresa closed her eyes briefly. I burned them after what happened. I was afraid they'd be found and somehow used against me. Blake was silent for a long moment. That information could have helped your case, or gotten me killed faster, Teresa countered. Men like Sheriff Davis wouldn't want that information public. They'd make sure I never testified. She couldn't read Blake's expression in the darkness, but his voice was measured when he spoke. You're probably right. Still, it explains why the search is so thorough. It's not just about justice for Charles, it's about making sure certain secrets stay buried with him. They watched the distant torches for a while longer before Blake finally guided Teresa back to the cabin. The easy companionship of earlier had been replaced by a more thoughtful silence, both of them contemplating the complications of their situation. Inside, Blake insisted again that Teresa take the bed while he made a pallet near the fire. She was too tired to argue, but as she lay in the darkness listening to Blake's steady breathing, sleep eluded her. Her mind raced with possibilities and dangers. What if they found her here? What if Blake was harmed because of her? What if they somehow made it through this, then what? She had no home, no money, no future she could envision. You're thinking too loud. Blake's voice came softly through the darkness. Teresa propped herself up on one elbow, barely able to make out his form in the dying firelight. I'm sorry, did I wake you? I wasn't asleep, he admitted. Too many thoughts of my own. About tomorrow, about many things. There was a rustling as Blake sat up. One day at a time, Teresa, that's all any of us can manage. Is that what you've done, taken one day at a time since the war? The fire popped and crackled, sending a brief flare of light across the cabin. In that moment, Teresa caught a glimpse of Blake's face open, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. It's the only way I know how to live, he said quietly, looking too far backward or forward. It's a good way to lose your footing in the present. Teresa considered his words. That's wise, but difficult. Most wise things are, Blake replied with a touch of humor. Now try to sleep. Tomorrow will come whether we're rested or not." Teresa lay back down, somehow comforted by their brief exchange. Blake's steady presence across the room was reassuring in a way she couldn't quite articulate. For the first time since Charles had come at her with that knife, she felt something like hope stirring in her chest. Morning arrived with a fine mist that shrouded the valley, turning the landscape ethereal. Teresa woke to find Blake already up, preparing to leave for Wallace. "I should be back before nightfall," he told her, checking his gun. "Keep the rifle close, just in case." "There's food in the root cellar and plenty of firewood stacked behind the cabin." Teresa nodded, trying to hide her apprehension at being left alone. "Be careful. If there's too much risk, don't try to reach Thomas." Blake paused in his preparations, studying her face. "I'll be careful," he promised, "but we need information if we're going to find a way out of this situation." "I know," Teresa acknowledged. "I just don't want you endangered because of me." Something softened in Blake's expression. "That's my choice to make." He hesitated, then added, "I left you a few things on the table that might help pass the time. I know waiting is the hardest part." After he'd gone, Teresa investigated what he'd left for her. A book of poetry, a small whittling knife with a piece of soft pine, and a harmonica. The unexpected thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to her eyes. She spent the morning exploring the cabin more thoroughly, finding evidence of Blake's careful, solitary life everywhere. His few clothes were neatly mended. His books, surprisingly numerous for a bachelor in the wilderness, showed signs of frequent reading. A small wooden chess set sat on a shelf, the pieces lovingly carved. In a drawer, Teresa found sketches, horses mainly, but also landscapes, wildlife, and occasionally people-weathered faces of miners, a laughing child, and elderly woman. Blake had talent, capturing expression and movement with a few sure strokes. The day stretched endlessly before her. To keep her hands and mind occupied, Teresa decided to prepare a proper meal for Blake's return. The root cellar yielded potatoes, onions, dried beans, and to her delight, several jars of preserved peaches. As she worked, Teresa found herself humming softly something she hadn't done in years. Charles had hated what he called her infernal caterwauling. The simple pleasure of making noise freely was unexpectedly liberating. By late afternoon, a savory stew simmered in the pot, and Teresa had attempted a rough batch of biscuits in the small Dutch oven. They weren't as light as she would have liked, but the cabin was filled with welcoming aromas. The sun was beginning to set when Teresa heard Rusty's distinctive gait approaching. Relief flooded through her as she hurried to the door. Blake dismounted wearily, his expression serious but not alarming. "Everything all right?" she asked as he led Rusty to the corral. "No trouble," Blake assured her, "but news from town is complicated." Teresa helped him unsaddle Rusty, working silently side by side until the horse was settled for the night. Only when they returned to the cabin did Blake elaborate. "They found your dress," he said without preamble, "by the creek near the abandoned cabin. Sheriff Davis is convinced you've either fled the territory or met with foul play." Teresa sank into a chair. "That buys us some time at least." "Perhaps," Blake agreed, though his tone suggested reservations. "Thomas also said there are rumors circulating about Charles' business dealings. Apparently someone broke into your house after the sheriff finished his investigation. The place was torn apart. Looking for the ledgers," Teresa whispered. "Charles' partners must be worried about what might be found." Blake nodded grimly. "Which means they have even more reason to find you." "Dead or alive," Teresa's brief flare of hope diminished, "so we're no better off than before." "I didn't say that." Blake removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Thomas mentioned something else. A federal marshal arrived in Wallace yesterday, a man named Howard Jenkins. Apparently he's been investigating corruption along the mining frontier. Word is Charles' name came up in his inquiries." Teresa straightened. "A federal marshal wouldn't be under Sheriff Davis' influence." "Exactly," Blake said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "And Thomas believes Jenkins is an honest man. If anyone might give you a fair hearing, it would be him." For the first time, Teresa allowed herself to consider the possibility of justice rather than just escape. How would we approach him without the sheriff knowing? That's the tricky part, Blake admitted. Jenkins is staying at the Wallace Hotel, heavily guarded after an apparent attempt to intimidate him his first night in town. Sheriff Davis, or one of Charles' other associates, Blake confirmed. Either way, reaching the marshal won't be simple. Teresa noticed Blake's exhausted posture and the strain around his eyes. "We can discuss this more after you've eaten," she said, moving to the fireplace. "I made stew." Surprise and something warmer flickered across Blake's face. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to," Teresa replied simply. It helped pass the time. They ate together, the food providing comfort after the troubling news. As the evening wore on, they strategized various approaches to contacting Marshal Jenkins, each presenting its own dangers. "What if Thomas approached him on our behalf?" Teresa suggested. Blake shook his head. "Too risky for Thomas, he has a family to consider." "Then perhaps a letter, that might work," Blake said thoughtfully, "if we could get it directly to Jenkins without interception." They continued discussing possibilities until late into the night. Eventually, fatigue overcame them both and they retired to their respective sleeping places. But as Teresa drifted toward sleep, a new worry took hold. The more Blake involved himself in her problems, the greater danger he faced. He had built a life here solitary but peaceful. She was threatening everything he had. Morning came with clarity. Over breakfast, Teresa shared her decision. "I should go to Wallace myself," she announced. "Turn myself in, but insist on speaking to Marshal Jenkins directly." Blake's response was immediate and firm. "Absolutely not." "It makes the most sense," Teresa argued. "Sheriff Davis wouldn't kill me outright. There would be too many witnesses. And once I spoke to Jenkins, once you were in custody, you would never get near Jenkins," Blake interrupted. "Davis would make sure of that. And accidents happen to prisoners all the time, especially ones who know too much." "Then what do you suggest?" Teresa demanded. "We can't hide up here forever, and I won't have you risking your life continually for me." Blake set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "I've been thinking about that. There's another option we haven't discussed, which is we leave together." Blake met her gaze steadily. "Head to Oregon or California, start fresh where no one knows us or what happened here." Teresa stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You would. You would leave your home, for me." "This cabin is just walls and a roof," Blake said quietly. "I built it once, I could build another." The implication of his words, the commitment they represented, left Teresa struggling for a response. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." Blake seemed to choose his words carefully. "In war, you learn to recognize things quickly: danger, opportunity, character. I've seen enough of you to know you're worth helping, Teresa. Beyond that," he hesitated, "I've been alone a long time, perhaps too long." The honesty of his statement hung between them, neither acknowledging nor dismissing the deeper current that had been building since their first meeting. "Let me think about it," Teresa finally said. Blake nodded, respecting her need for time. "Of course. Meanwhile, I'll see about gathering supplies, just in case we need to leave quickly." The day passed in quiet productivity. Blake repaired tack and prepared ammunition, while Teresa took inventory of food supplies and mended a tear in one of Blake's shirts. They worked mostly in silence, each contemplating the path that had brought them together and the uncertain road ahead. By evening, a decision still eluded Teresa. The idea of fleeing with Blake was both terrifying and exhilarating. To start anew somewhere, free from Charles' shadow and the law's pursuit. But to build that freedom on an unresolved crime felt wrong somehow. "You're still troubled," Blake observed as they sat before the fire after dinner. Teresa sighed. "I keep thinking about what you said about the truth having power. If I run, the truth about Charles dies with him. His partners continue their schemes, and I live looking over my shoulder forever." Blake leaned forward, firelight dancing across his features. What if there was a third option? Not surrender, not permanent flight, but something else entirely. "I'm listening." "Thomas mentioned that Jenkins is expected to remain in Wallace for at least 2 weeks, investigating various claims of corruption. What if we waited until near the end of his stay, then arranged a private meeting? Somewhere neutral, away from the sheriff's influence." Teresa considered the suggestion. How would we arrange such a meeting? Thomas could deliver a message, making it clear you have information about Charles' dealings that would interest a federal investigator. Include enough specific details to prove you're credible. And if Jenkins agrees, we choose the location carefully, meet him with evidence of your abuse and Charles' crimes. Once he understands the full situation, he might be able to protect you officially. It was a risky plan filled with potential complications, but it offered what Teresa needed most, a chance at real justice, not just escape. It could work, she admitted. But it means staying here longer, increasing the risk to you. Blake smiled slightly. I've faced worse odds. For the first time in days, Teresa felt the weight on her shoulders lighten somewhat. Having a plan, however dangerous, was preferable to endless hiding or desperate flight. We'll need to be careful about the message, she said, already thinking through the details. Enough information to interest Jenkins, but not enough to incriminate me fully if it falls into the wrong hands. Blake nodded approvingly. You have a tactical mind, Teresa Nichols. Survival teaches many skills, she replied with a touch of grimness, including caution. As they refined their plan into the night, Teresa found herself watching Blake, the concentration in his eyes as he worked through each contingency, the strength in his hands as he sketched a map of potential meeting locations, the occasional smile that transformed his serious expression when she offered a particularly clever suggestion. This was a man unlike any she had known before. Where Charles had been all flash and charm concealing darkness, Blake was steady and true, his rough exterior hiding unexpected depths of gentleness and intelligence. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. What? Blake asked, catching her observation. Teresa shook her head slightly. Nothing, just thank you for everything. Something passed between them, then an understanding, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. Blake reached across the table, briefly covering her hand with his. We'll get through this, he promised, one way or another. That night, Teresa dreamed not of blood and pursuit, but of wide, open spaces and freedom, and when she woke, the decision was clear in her mind. They would try for justice first. Running would always remain an option if their plan failed. The next several days fell into a rhythm as they prepared. Blake made another trip to Wallace, this time bringing back paper and ink for Teresa to draft her message to Jenkins. She wrote carefully, including specific details about Charles' smuggling operation that only his wife could know, while making her case for a private meeting. Blake also brought news that the intense search for Teresa had diminished somewhat, though Sheriff Davis still had men watching the main roads out of the county. More concerning was the report that some of Charles' business associates from outside Wallace had arrived in town, asking questions and offering rewards for information about Teresa's whereabouts. They're more worried about those ledgers than avenging Charles, Blake observed as they discussed this development. They don't know I destroyed them, Teresa pointed out, which might work to our advantage with Jenkins. He'll be more inclined to offer protection if he believes I have physical evidence. Blake looked troubled. I don't like building our strategy on a lie. Not a lie, Teresa corrected. I memorized much of what was in those ledgers. Names, dates, amounts. I can recreate enough to be useful. Blake's expression cleared somewhat. That's different then. Still risky, but honest. His integrity was another quality that continued to impress Teresa. Even in desperate circumstances, Blake maintained a moral compass that never seemed to waver. As days turned into a week, they settled into an unlikely domesticity. Teresa found herself looking forward to their evening conversations by the fire, where they shared stories of their lives before fate had thrown them together. She learned about Blake's childhood in Ohio, his brief time at university before the war, his dreams of someday breeding horses on a proper ranch. In turn, she told him about her mother's death when she was 16, her father's patient lessons in horsemanship, her own youthful ambitions to travel and see the world beyond Montana's borders, dreams that had died when financial necessity forced her marriage to Charles. It's not too late for those dreams, Blake said one evening. You're still young, Teresa smiled sadly. I'm not the same girl who had those dreams. She died long ago, I think, Or perhaps she just went dormant, Blake suggested, waiting for the right conditions to return. The metaphor reminded Teresa of something. Like those desert flowers Thomas brought back from Arizona, the ones that can sleep for years until the rains come, Blake nodded. Exactly like that. Resilience is a powerful thing, Teresa. I've seen it in horses given up for untrainable. I see it in you. His faith in her was like water on parched soil, nourishing something long neglected. Teresa found herself smiling more, standing straighter, speaking her mind without the reflexive flinch that had become habit with Charles. On their 9th day together, Blake took Teresa deeper into the hills to a hidden spring he particularly loved. The day was unseasonably warm, the sky a perfect blue canopy above the pine-scented forest. After their tension and planning, the simple outing felt like an extraordinary gift. The spring formed a small, crystal-clear pool before continuing down the mountainside as a stream. Wildflowers dotted the surrounding meadow and birdsong filled the air. They ate a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried fruit, sitting side by side on sun-warmed rocks. "This is my favorite place," Blake admitted. "I come here when decisions need making or peace needs finding." Teresa understood why immediately. The place had a quality of timelessness, as if the world's troubles couldn't quite reach into this hidden pocket of beauty. "Thank you for sharing it with me," she said softly. Blake turned to face her, his expression unusually open. "Teresa, there's something I should say before we move forward with our plan." Her heart quickened at his serious tone. "What is it, these past days with you?" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "They've made me realize how empty my life had become, how much I'd withdrawn from everything that makes life worth living." Teresa hardly dared breathe, afraid to interrupt whatever he was trying to express. "I know the timing is impossible," Blake continued, "and you have every reason to distrust men after what you've endured. But I need you to know that whatever happens with Jenkins, however this situation resolves, my helping you was never just about doing the right thing." "What was it about?" Teresa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake met her gaze directly. "It was about you. The woman who faced death rather than endure one more day of cruelty. The woman who showed more courage and intelligence in crisis than most show in a lifetime. The woman I've come to." He hesitated, then finished simply, "Care for more than I thought possible." Teresa's throat tightened with emotion. No man had ever spoken to her with such genuine respect and admiration, not even her father, who had loved her dearly but always seen her as his little girl. "Blake," she began, uncertain how to respond to such honesty. Before she could continue, he shook his head slightly. "You don't need to say anything. I know it's too soon and our future is too uncertain. I just wanted you to know in case." He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. Their plan carried real danger. There were no guarantees. Impulsively, Teresa reached out, placing her hand over his. "I feel it too," she admitted. "This connection between us, it terrifies me and comforts me at the same time." Blake turned his hand to clasp hers, his grip warm and strong. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the simple contact saying more than words could express. Eventually, Blake cleared his throat. "We should head back before dark." Teresa nodded, but neither moved immediately, reluctant to break this moment of perfect understanding. When they finally stood, something had shifted between them, a threshold crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The walk back to the cabin was quiet but companionable, their hands occasionally brushing, both hyper-aware of the other's presence. The future remained uncertain, fraught with danger and complications, but for the first time in years, Teresa felt the stirring of real hope, not just for survival, but for happiness. That evening, as they finalized their plan to contact Marshal Jenkins, their movements around the small cabin had a new synchronicity, as if they had been sharing this space for years rather than days. Their fingers lingered when passing objects, their eyes meeting more frequently, small smiles exchanged in quiet moments. "I'll take the message to Thomas tomorrow," Blake said as they prepared for sleep. "If all goes well, Jenkins could receive it the following day." Teresa nodded, the reality of their situation reasserting itself. "And then we wait for his response. We'll suggest meeting 3 days after he receives the message," Blake confirmed. That gives him time to consider, but not so much time that he might set up an elaborate trap if he's not the honest man Thomas believes. And if he doesn't come, Blake's expression was resolute. Then we implement our backup plan, head west immediately, using the routes we've discussed. Teresa moved to the bed, then paused, turning back to Blake. I don't want to be alone tonight, she said quietly. Would you just hold me, nothing more, I just need to feel safe, Blake finished for her, understanding in his eyes. Human, Teresa corrected. Connected. Blake hesitated only briefly before nodding. Of course. They lay together on the narrow bed, Blake's arm around Teresa's waist, her back against his chest. The simple human contact was profoundly comforting, a reminder that whatever tomorrow brought, tonight they were not alone. Teresa fell asleep listening to Blake's steady heartbeat, more at peace than she had been in years. Morning came with a sense of purpose. Blake prepared to leave for Wallace with their carefully crafted message for Jenkins, while Teresa focused on organizing their supplies for either outcome success or the need for immediate flight. At the door, Blake paused. Be vigilant while I'm gone, keep the rifle close. Teresa nodded, the weight of their plans settling on her shoulders. Be careful in town, Sheriff Davis might have men watching Thomas. I'll be careful, Blake promised. He hesitated, then stepped closer, his hand coming up to gently touch her cheek. Teresa. She looked up at him, at this man who had become her protector, her confidant, and perhaps something more. I know, she whispered. Blake leaned down, pressing his lips gently to her forehead, a gesture both tender and respectful. Then he was gone, leaving Teresa alone with her thoughts and preparations. The day passed slowly. Teresa kept busy, checking and rechecking their supplies, mentally rehearsing what she would say to Jenkins if he agreed to meet. She tried to anticipate his questions, prepare her responses, remember every detail from Charles' ledgers that might prove useful. By late afternoon, restlessness drove her outside. The weather had turned, clouds gathering ominously over the distant peaks. A storm was coming and Blake was still not back. Teresa paced the small valley, trying to calm her growing anxiety. Just as the first raindrops began to fall, she heard hoofbeats approaching, too many for just Blake and Rusty. Panic surged through her as she grabbed the rifle and took cover behind a large boulder near the cabin entrance. 3 riders emerged from the ravine, Blake in the lead, followed by Thomas Green and a third man Teresa didn't recognize. She kept the rifle raised until Blake called out to her. It's all right, Teresa, they're friends. She lowered the weapon cautiously, stepping out from her hiding place as the men dismounted. The storm broke in earnest, driving them all quickly into the cabin. What happened? Teresa demanded once they were inside. Why are they here? Blake's expression was grim as he removed his dripping hat. Plans changed. Thomas, this is Teresa Nichols. Teresa, Thomas Green and Marshal Howard Jenkins. Teresa stared at the third man, tall, gray-haired, with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Marshal Jenkins. But our message never needed to be delivered, Thomas Green interrupted. He was a barrel-chested man with massive forearms and a thick beard. Jenkins approached me this morning, asking questions about Charles Nichols and his associates. Jenkins stepped forward, his keen gaze assessing Teresa. Mrs. Nichols, I've been investigating corruption in mining communities across 3 territories for the past year. Your husband's name has appeared repeatedly in my inquiries. Then you know what kind of man he was, Teresa said cautiously. Jenkins nodded. I was gathering evidence to bring charges against him when I received news of his death. Naturally, I became interested in the circumstances, particularly when I learned his widow was being hunted for his murder with unusual zeal by the local sheriff. Blake moved to stand beside Teresa, his presence reassuring. We can trust Jenkins, he said quietly. He's already arrested 2 of Sheriff Davis' deputies for tampering with evidence in another case. Davis is finished in Wallace, Jenkins confirmed. He just doesn't know it yet. I have federal agents arriving tomorrow to take him into custody on multiple charges of corruption. Hope and disbelief warred within Teresa. And what about me? I still killed my husband. Jenkins' expression softened slightly. Mr. Green has provided testimony about the visible abuse you suffered over the years. Dr. Wilson has also come forward with medical records documenting your injuries, combined with your statement about the events of that night. You believe it was self-defense, Teresa finished. I believe a jury will, Jenkins corrected, but only if you come back and face the charges properly. Running makes you look guilty, Mrs. Nichols. Teresa glanced at Blake, seeing both support and concern in his eyes. The choice was hers. If I return with you, she said carefully, what guarantees do I have that Sheriff Davis won't simply have me killed before your federal agents arrive? That's why we came directly to you, Jenkins explained. You'll remain here tonight. Tomorrow my agents will take Davis into custody at dawn. Only then will we bring you into Wallace, directly to the circuit judge who arrived with me last week. It seemed too simple, too neat after days of fear and planning, and you came all this way yourself rather than sending a message because. Jenkins smiled slightly, appreciation in his eyes at her skepticism. Because I needed to see for myself what kind of woman you are, Mrs. Nichols. Cases like yours are complex. Character matters. The rain pounded on the cabin roof as they discussed details far into the evening. Thomas eventually excused himself to prepare coffee, leaving Teresa, Blake, and Jenkins at the table reviewing the statement Teresa would give to the judge. You've remembered a remarkable amount from those ledgers, Jenkins commented after Teresa had recited names, dates, and amounts from memory. I had 3 years to study them when Charles thought I wasn't looking, Teresa replied. He believed me too simple to understand his business dealings. His mistake, Jenkins observed, one of many, it seems. As the night wore on, Thomas and Jenkins bedded down near the fire, while Teresa and Blake retreated to the far corner of the cabin for a private conversation. Are you certain about this? Blake asked softly, concern evident in his face. We could still leave tonight while they're sleeping. Head west as we planned. Teresa shook her head. No, I need to face this properly. If there's a chance for real justice, I have to try. Blake studied her face in the dim light. You're the bravest person I've ever known, Teresa Nichols. She smiled faintly. Not brave. Just tired of running from the truth. What truth is that? Teresa considered her answer carefully. That sometimes survival requires difficult choices, that justice and law aren't always the same thing, that I'm not the woman Charles tried to make me into, frightened, passive, broken. Blake's hand found hers in the darkness. No, you certainly are not. They stayed that way for a long time, hands clasped, drawing strength from each other for whatever tomorrow would bring. Morning arrived with clearing skies and renewed purpose. Jenkins and Thomas prepared to leave first to ensure all was ready in town before Blake brought Teresa in. We'll send word when it's safe, Jenkins assured them, mounting his horse. Should be before midday. After they'd gone, Blake and Teresa made their final preparations in companionable silence. The possibility of separation loomed between them if Teresa was taken into custody pending a trial, or if Blake was implicated in harboring a fugitive. Whatever happens, Blake said finally, I meant what I said yesterday by the spring. Teresa looked up from packing the few personal items she'd accumulated during her stay. As did I. Blake stepped closer, his expression earnest. When this is over, if you're cleared as Jenkins believes you will be, would you consider? He hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. Would you consider a future that includes me? Teresa's heart swelled with emotion. After everything Charles had put her through, she had never expected to trust a man again, let alone contemplate a life with one. Yet here was Blake, patient, honorable, gentle Blake, offering her a future she had thought forever lost. Yes, she said simply. I would consider that very carefully. Blake's smile transformed his face, years of solitude and seriousness falling away. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down. Their first kiss was tentative, gentle, a promise rather than a demand. When they separated, Teresa felt lighter somehow, as if the last chains of her life with Charles had finally fallen away. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with this good man beside her. Thomas returned just before noon with news. Sheriff Davis had been arrested without incident, along with several of his deputies and two of Charles' business associates. The circuit judge was prepared to hear Teresa's case immediately. The ride into Wallace was tense, Teresa's anxiety growing with each familiar landmark they passed. Blake stayed close beside her, his steady presence the only thing keeping her from turning Rusty around and fleeing back to the hills. The town itself seemed oddly subdued, citizens gathering in small groups, talking in hushed voices about the morning's dramatic events. Many eyes followed Teresa as Blake escorted her to the courthouse, but no one approached or called out. Judge William Harrington was a severe-looking man with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for fairness. He listened without interruption as Teresa recounted her marriage to Charles, the escalating abuse, and finally the desperate struggle that had ended in his death. Jenkins presented supporting testimony from Dr. Wilson and Thomas Green, as well as evidence of Charles' criminal enterprises that established motive for others who might have wished Teresa silenced permanently. Throughout the proceedings, Blake remained in the courtroom, his unwavering gaze giving Teresa strength when her voice faltered or memories threatened to overwhelm her. After 4 hours of testimony, Judge Harrington rendered his decision: justifiable homicide in self-defense. Teresa was free to go, with the court's sympathies for her suffering. The relief was so intense that Teresa's legs nearly gave way as she left the courthouse. Blake was there immediately, his arm supporting her as they walked into the late afternoon sunlight. "It's over," she whispered, hardly able to believe it. "Not over," Blake corrected gently. "Just beginning." Marshal Jenkins found them as they prepared to leave town. "Mrs. Nichols, I wanted to thank you personally. Your testimony has provided the final pieces we needed to dismantle a network of corruption that spans 3 territories." Teresa nodded, still somewhat dazed by her newfound freedom. "I'm glad some good has come from it all." "What will you do now?" Jenkins asked. Teresa glanced at Blake, a silent communication passing between them. "Heal," she answered simply, "and then build something new." Jenkins smiled, understanding in his eyes as he looked between them. "Good luck to you both. You deserve some happiness after all this." As they rode out of Wallace, Teresa felt the weight of the past 3 years gradually lifting from her shoulders. She had entered Charles Nichols' house as a desperate young woman with few options. She was leaving his legacy behind as someone stronger, wiser, and surprisingly hopeful. "Where to?" Blake asked as they reached the fork in the road that led either back to his hidden cabin or onward to new horizons. Teresa considered the question. "Your cabin for now. I think we both need time to recover from all this." After a moment, she added, "And then perhaps Oregon. You mentioned wanting to breed horses on a proper ranch someday." Blake's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Oregon it is, then, when we're ready." They rode side by side into the gathering dusk, not as fugitive and protector, but as equals facing an uncertain but promising future together. Teresa thought of the desert flowers she had mentioned days earlier, dormant but resilient, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. Spring had finally arrived in her life, and with it, the chance to flourish once more. 3 months later, Teresa stood on the porch of Blake's cabin, their cabin now, watching as he worked with a spirited young mare in the expanded corral. The horse was fighting the saddle, but Blake's patience was unwavering, his voice a constant gentle reassurance. Life had settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected, but both had embraced wholeheartedly. News from Wallace confirmed that Sheriff Davis and several of Charles' associates had been convicted on numerous charges. The town was rebuilding itself under more honest leadership. Teresa had reclaimed her maiden name, Nielsen, shedding the last vestige of her life with Charles. The nightmares still came occasionally, but less frequently now, and Blake was always there when she woke trembling in the darkness. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully, both of them conscious of Teresa's need to heal and rediscover herself beyond survival. Blake never pushed, never demanded, content to let her set the pace of their growing intimacy. 2 weeks earlier, beneath the stars by their favorite mountain spring, Blake had asked Teresa to marry him. She had accepted without hesitation. certain in a way she had never been with Charles that this union would be one of respect and genuine love. Now, as summer faded toward autumn, they were making final preparations to leave for Oregon before the mountain passes became treacherous with snow. Thomas Green had connections with a rancher near Portland who was willing to sell a small property with good pasture and access to water perfect for the horse breeding operation Blake had dreamed of establishing. "You're deep in thought," Blake observed, appearing at the bottom of the porch steps. He was dusty from his work with the mare, but his smile was bright. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Teresa replied. "How much we've changed." Blake climbed the steps to stand beside her, respectfully keeping a small distance, always careful to let her choose their physical proximity. "For the better, I hope," Teresa closed the gap between them, taking his hand. "Definitely for the better." In the corral, the young mare had calmed, accepting the saddle now with only occasional nervous movements. Teresa watched the animal's transformation with understanding. Trust came hard after mistreatment, but with patience and consistency, healing was possible. "She'll make a fine riding horse," Blake commented, following Teresa's gaze. Not everyone would have seen her potential beneath that fear and anger. "It takes someone who understands both," Teresa said quietly. Blake's arm slipped around her waist, and she leaned into his embrace, still marveling at how different it felt from Charles' possessive grip, like the difference between a cage and a shelter, between ownership and partnership. That evening, as they sat before the fire discussing their future plans, Teresa found herself overcome with gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought Blake to that abandoned cabin on the night she fled. What had begun as a desperate escape had somehow transformed into a journey towards something she had never thought possible, a life defined by love rather than fear. "What is it?" Blake asked, noticing her expression. Teresa smiled, reaching for his hand. "I was just thinking that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best, if we're brave enough to keep moving forward." Blake brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "And if we're fortunate enough to find the right companion for the journey." 2 weeks later, they were married by a traveling preacher who stopped at their cabin on his circuit through the mountain communities. Thomas Green and his family made the journey to witness the simple ceremony, along with a few of Blake's trusted friends from his horse trading business. The celebration was modest but joyful, with music from an impromptu band of miners who brought fiddles and harmonicas. Teresa wore a new dress of deep blue calico with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Blake had shaved his beard for the occasion, revealing a strong jawline and a small scar near his chin that Teresa had never seen before. As they spoke their vows beneath the pine trees, with autumn sunlight dappling the ground around them, Teresa felt a circle closing the end of one life and the beginning of another. Not an escape this time, but a conscious choice to build something meaningful and lasting with the man who had first been her protector, then her friend, and now her husband. Their journey to Oregon the following week was challenging, but filled with a sense of adventure neither had experienced before. They traveled with 4 horses Rusty, the young mare Teresa had named Hope, and 2 strong geldings for trading or selling upon arrival. The landscape changed dramatically as they moved westward, from rugged mountains to rolling hills and finally to the lush, green valleys near Portland. The ranch they purchased was modest 50 acres with a small cabin that needed work, a barn in reasonable repair, and good grazing land with a year-round creek. "It needs some attention," Blake acknowledged as they surveyed their new home, "but the bones are good." Teresa smiled at his assessment. Like us, winter came early that year, but they were prepared. Together they had reinforced the cabin walls, repaired the roof, and stocked provisions to last until spring. The work was hard but satisfying, each improvement a visible sign of their commitment to building a life together. Word of Blake's skill with difficult horses spread quickly through the surrounding communities. By spring, they had their first clients bringing animals for training. Teresa's knowledge of horsemanship complemented Blake's, her gentler approach often succeeding where his more direct methods encountered resistance. "We make a good team," Blake observed one evening as they discussed a particularly challenging stallion brought by a wealthy rancher from Salem. "I never thought I'd find someone who understood horses the way I do. Or someone who understood people the way you don't," Teresa teased, her confidence and humor having blossomed in their months together. Blake laughed, pulling her into an embrace. "That's why I needed you. To translate the human world for me." Their first year passed in a blur of hard work, small triumphs, and deepening connection. The nightmares that had plagued Teresa grew rarer, replaced by dreams of expansion for their business and perhaps someday children. News occasionally reached them from Idaho Marshal Jenkins continuing his cleanup of corruption throughout the territory, Wallace thriving under more honest leadership, Charles' former associates serving time in federal prison. Each report felt more distant, like stories from someone else's life. On the anniversary of their wedding, Blake surprised Teresa with a gift, a beautiful bay mare, heavy with foal from one of the best bloodlines in Oregon. "She'll be the foundation of our breeding program," he explained as Teresa admired the animal. "Strong, intelligent, and gentle. Like someone else I know." Teresa's eyes filled with tears at the thoughtfulness of the gift, not just the mare itself, but what it represented, Blake's absolute faith in their future together. "I have something for you too," she said softly, "though it won't arrive for about 7 more months." Blake's expression shifted from confusion to wonder as her meaning registered. We're, Teresa nodded, laughing at his speechlessness. "Yes, we're going to have a baby. Dr. Collins confirmed it yesterday when I went into town for supplies." Blake lifted her off her feet in a gentle embrace, his joy palpable. "Teresa," he whispered against her hair, "I never thought I could be this happy." "Nor I," she admitted, holding him tightly, "not after everything, but here we are." Their son, Matthew James Jamison, was born the following spring, a healthy, strong boy with his father's serious expression and his mother's determined spirit. As Teresa held him for the first time, Blake sitting beside them on the bed, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just 2 years. From a woman hiding in an abandoned cabin, certain her life was over, to a wife, mother, and business partner building something meaningful in this beautiful valley, it seemed almost impossible to reconcile these two realities. "What are you thinking?" Blake asked, his finger caught in his son's tiny grip. Teresa smiled, the happiness in her heart almost overwhelming. "I'm thinking that life is strange and wonderful, that sometimes we have to lose everything to find what we really need." Blake leaned forward, kissing her gently. "And sometimes, when we're standing guard over someone who needs protection, we discover they're actually guarding something precious in us as well." Teresa knew he was right. In saving her that night in the abandoned cabin, Blake had also saved himself from the isolation he'd chosen after the war. They had healed each other day by day, moment by moment, creating something neither had believed possible. A life defined not by what they were running from, but by what they were building together. As Matthew drifted to sleep in her arms, and Blake's hand rested warm and steady on her shoulder, Teresa offered a silent thanks to whatever fate or providence had brought them together on that desperate night 2 years ago. From the darkness of fear and violence had emerged this precious, ordinary miracle, a family, a home, a future bright with possibility. And she knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them as they had faced everything since that first night, side by side, standing guard over each other's hearts.